The dog found the wood first. Martha Kessler stood at the edge of the timber yard with her hand shading her eyes against the low autumn sun, watching Duke nose through a pile of rejected walnut logs stacked crooked against the fence line. The logs were twisted, every one of them, spiraled through the grain like a rope wrung out by a giant fist. Nobody wanted twisted walnut. Everybody in the county knew that. Straight grain sawed clean and sold well. Twisted grain split wrong, warped in the kiln, cracked boards before they ever reached a customer's parlor. The timber company had been hauling these logs out of the North Ridge for 3 years and stacking them here, at the edge of their yard, because burning them was cheaper than trying to mill them. Duke barked once at the pile, short and sharp, then sat down in front of it like he expected someone to throw him a bone from inside the wood itself. "You've got strange taste, old man," Martha said to the dog, but she was already walking closer. She was 27 years old and had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas, had gone out to check on stock during a spring storm and never come back, and they had found him 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine with his horse dead beside him. Since then it had been Martha and Duke on the ranch, 400 acres of grass and rock that Thomas's father had claimed 20 years before, and neither of them had figured out yet how a young woman alone was supposed to keep 400 acres from going to seed. She pressed her hand flat against the bark of the topmost log. It was rough and cold under her palm, the twist in the grain visible even through the bark, a slow corkscrew rise from root to crown. Something about it held her there longer than she meant to stand. "You lost, ma'am?" She turned. A young man stood by the mill shed, wiping his hands on a rag that had gone past the point of being useful for wiping anything. He looked to be maybe 20, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of squint that came from years of watching sawdust fly. His name was Boone Whitfield, and he ran the mill for old man Garrity, who owned the timber company and rarely came out from town anymore. "No," Martha said. "I'm looking at your reject pile." Boone laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension young men reserved for questions they found foolish. "That ain't a pile you want to be looking at. That's twisted walnut. Won't saw straight, won't season right, won't do nothing but split and crack and waste a man's time. We just burn it for the stove most winters." "How much would you take for the whole stack?" He stopped wiping his hands. "The whole stack?" "All of it, however many logs are there." "Ma'am, I don't rightly know what you'd want with a stack of firewood-grade walnut, but if you're set on it, I reckon Mr. Garrity would be glad to have it off the yard, save us the trouble of burning it ourselves." He named a price so low it embarrassed her to accept it, the price of scrap and nothing more, and she paid him from the small tin box of coin she kept under the floorboard of the ranch house, money that was supposed to last through winter for flour and salt and lamp oil. "You're not planning on carving something out of that, are you?" Boone asked, eyeing the twisted grain with visible skepticism. "Because I'll tell you now, a knife won't hold a line in wood that fights you like that." "I don't carve," Martha said. "I build." "Build what?" She didn't answer right away. Truth was, she didn't entirely know yet. She only knew that when she pressed her hand against that twisted grain, something in her chest had gone quiet and certain in a way nothing had since Thomas died. It was the first thing in 14 months that had felt like it belonged to her and not to grief. "Furniture," she said finally. "Fine furniture." Boone's laugh this time was less kind. "Out of that? Ma'am, no offense meant, but you'd be better off burning it like we do. Twisted grain don't make fine anything. It makes kindling." Martha didn't argue. She hired 2 of Garrity's men to haul the logs out to her ranch on a flatbed wagon, and Duke rode the whole way perched on top of the pile like he was guarding treasure. And that night she stood in the moonlight behind her barn and pressed her hand against the wood again and told herself she would find a way to make it answer to her. That evening her nearest neighbor, a widower named Otis Renfrew, who ran cattle 2 miles east and had taken to checking in on her more often than she strictly needed since Thomas passed, rode over to see what the commotion of a delivery wagon had been about. He looked at the stack of logs behind her barn with the same expression Boone had worn, a kind of patient disbelief. "Twisted walnut," he said. "You know that's no good for milling, Martha." "I've heard." "It'll fight the saw, fight the plane, fight everything you try to do to it. There's a reason nobody wants it." "Maybe nobody's tried hard enough." Otis shook his head, not in anger, but in the tired way of a man who had seen enough failed schemes to recognize the shape of another one starting. "You're Thomas, rest him. He'd have told you the same. Straight grain or no grain at all. That's how his daddy built this ranch." "Thomas isn't here to tell me anything," Martha said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, though not unkind. Otis had the grace to look down at his boots. "I only worry for you," he said. "Alone out here with winter coming." "I'm not alone. I've got Duke." The dog, hearing his name, thumped his tail against the porch boards, and Otis allowed himself a small, tired smile before he mounted up and rode home, leaving Martha alone with her pile of worthless wood and a feeling in her chest she couldn't yet name but refused to let go of. The first attempts were failures, and they were expensive failures, the kind that cost her money she didn't have to spare. She'd learned rough carpentry from Thomas, enough to mend fences and frame a shed, but fine furniture was a different trade altogether, one that required a joiner's precision and a cabinet-maker's patience, neither of which she possessed yet. She split 3 logs trying to plank them the way Thomas had shown her for barn lumber, and each one cracked along its twisted grain exactly the way Boone had predicted, the wood splintering unevenly, warping the moment it dried, refusing to hold a straight edge no matter how careful her hand. She sat on an overturned crate one evening in early November, with the ruined boards scattered around her, and put her face in her hands, and Duke came and put his head in her lap, and she let herself cry for a while. Not just for the wasted wood and the wasted coin, but for Thomas and the ravine and the 14 months of silence that had followed. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said to the dog, who offered no opinion, but stayed pressed against her leg until the shaking in her shoulders stopped. She thought about giving up. She thought about it seriously, lying awake that night, listening to the wind work at the shutters, calculating how many months of flour and salt she'd spent on a fool's errand. But in the morning she went back out to the woodpile and pressed her hand flat against one of the unsplit logs, feeling the twist of the grain rise beneath her palm like something alive. And she thought about how Thomas used to say that the ranch's best grazing land was the rockiest, the ground everyone else had passed over because it looked too hard to work. Maybe the wood was the same. Maybe the twist wasn't a flaw to be beaten straight. Maybe it was the very thing that made it worth something, if only she could learn to work with it instead of against it. She spent the next several weeks not building anything at all, but studying. She rode into town and spent an afternoon in the back room of the dry goods store, where old Ezra Coombs, who had been a joiner in his younger years before his hands went stiff with age, kept a shelf of battered trade manuals nobody else wanted. He let her borrow 2 of them for the price of a promise to return them, and she read by lamplight every night after her chores were done, learning about grain orientation and moisture seasoning, and the particular techniques European cabinet makers used for burled and figured woods, timber that twisted and swirled the same way her walnut did. Timber that fetched premium prices from collectors precisely because of its irregularity, rather than despite it. The word that kept appearing in the manuals was one she'd never had cause to use before. Figured wood. Wood whose grain moved in patterns instead of straight lines, prized by fine furniture makers in the cities back east and across the ocean for the way light played across its surface, for the depth and shimmer no straight-grained board could match. The very thing that made twisted walnut impossible to mill for lumber was the thing that made it beautiful when handled correctly. It had to be sawn a particular way, quarter sawn rather than plain sawn, cut against its instinct rather than with it, and it had to be seasoned slow, much slower than straight grain, or it would crack exactly the way her first 3 logs had cracked. Winter set in hard that year, and Martha spent it learning to work with her hands in a new way, cutting slowly, testing angles, ruining more wood before she stopped ruining it. Duke stayed with her through the cold months in the small workshop she'd cleared out of the old tack room, curled by the stove while she planed and sanded and swore under her breath at boards that split anyway, despite her best efforts. Otis came by twice a month with a sack of flour or a joint of meat, more out of neighborly worry than expectation of repayment, and each time he found her a little further along, a little more sure-handed, though the finished pieces were still rough, still amateur. "You're still at it," he said one January afternoon, standing in the doorway of the tack room with snow melting off his hat brim. "Still at it," she agreed, not looking up from the tabletop she was sanding, a small side table with a top that swirled like water frozen mid-current. He looked at it for a long moment. "That's something," he admitted. "I didn't expect that." "Nobody did." "Didn't ask if it would work," he said, half to himself. "Guess I should have asked what happened to it instead." Martha looked up at that. "What do you mean?" "I mean everybody in this county looked at that reject pile and asked whether it was any good. You looked at it and asked what it could become. Different question." She thought about that for a long time after he left, turning the words over the way she turned the wood over in her hands, testing the grain from every angle before she committed the plane to it. By March, she had finished her first true piece, a writing desk with a top cut from the largest of the original logs, the figure in the grain rippling across the surface in waves that caught the lamplight and threw it back in shifting patterns. Gold and amber and deep chocolate brown, all moving together depending on where a person stood. She had built the legs and frame from a straighter section of the same log, so the whole piece matched in color, while the top alone carried the wild, swirling figure. And when she stood back and looked at it in the light of her workshop window, she felt something she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. Pride, plain and simple, and something like hope beside it. She didn't know what to do with it, though. There was no market in the county for a writing desk with an unusual grain pattern. Not among ranchers and shopkeepers who wanted plain, sturdy furniture that would survive children and dust and decades of use without complaint. She loaded the desk onto her wagon anyway, Duke riding beside her on the seat with his tongue out in the spring wind, and drove the 2 hours into the county seat where there was a general store that sometimes took furniture on consignment, mostly chairs and cradles made by local farmers in their off-seasons. The store owner, a heavy-set man named Franklin Voss, looked at the desk with the same skepticism everyone else had shown the raw logs. "Never seen wood like that," he said, running his hand over the swirling top. "Sure is pretty, but I don't know as anybody around here would pay extra for pretty when plain does the job just as well." "Put it on consignment anyway," Martha said. "If it doesn't sell in 2 months, I'll take it back." He agreed, mostly to be rid of the conversation, and Martha rode home not entirely sure she'd done anything but waste another month of effort on a piece that might sit in the corner of a dusty store, gathering more dust than customers. But 3 weeks later, a traveler passed through the county seat, a man who bought and sold curiosities and fine goods for a shop in Denver, and he saw the desk sitting in the corner of Franklin Voss's store and stopped walking. He ran his hand across the grain the same way Martha had the very first day, standing in front of the reject pile, and he asked Franklin who had made it. "Have you ever noticed how the things people throw away are so often the very things somebody else has been searching for their whole life? It's a strange truth of the world that value isn't fixed in the object itself, but in whether the right eyes ever fall upon it. The timber company saw firewood. The traveler from Denver saw something he hadn't found in 2 years of searching, and he paid Franklin 4 times what a plain desk would have fetched, and told him if the maker had any more like it, he'd buy every piece she could produce and pay a fair price for the privilege. If you're finding this story worth your time, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Stories like Martha's remind us that patience and a willingness to see past the surface can turn what the world calls worthless into something extraordinary. And there's more of that kind of story waiting for you here if you stick around. Franklin sent word out to the ranch by way of a boy who rode the mail route, and when Martha read the note, her hands shook so badly she had to sit down on the porch steps with Duke pressed against her side before she could finish reading it twice more to be sure she understood correctly. 4 times the price. A standing order for more. She sat there until the sun went down, and for the first time in over a year, she let herself imagine a future that didn't feel like a slow slide toward losing everything Thomas had left her. She went back to the timber yard the following week, and this time, when she asked Boone about the reject pile, he didn't laugh. "Word's gotten around," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Garrity's been asking after you. Wants to know if you'd be interested in buying the twisted logs regular instead of just the once." "How much is he asking now?" Boone named a price, still fair, but noticeably higher than before, and Martha understood without being told that word of the Denver sale had traveled through the county the way word always did, from Franklin's store to the saloon to the timber yard, each telling adding a little more to the sum of money involved, until the story had grown into something almost unrecognizable from the plain truth of it. She didn't haggle. She agreed to the price and arranged for regular deliveries. 1 wagon load every month through the spring and summer, more twisted walnut than she could have imagined needing back when she'd stood at the edge of that yard with her hand on the first cold log. The next 2 years were the hardest and the fullest of her life. She hired a boy from town, an orphan named Nathaniel, who'd been sleeping in the livery stable and doing odd jobs for meals, to help haul and season the wood while she focused on the joinery and finishing work that required a trained hand. She built a proper drying shed with slatted walls to let air move slow and even through the stacked boards, learned to read moisture in a plank by weight and sound the way old Ezra Coombs had described in his manuals, learned which sections of twisted grain would hold a mortise joint and which would split if pushed too hard. She had failures still, plenty of them, boards that cracked in the shed despite her best care, joints that didn't hold, finishes that dulled the figure instead of bringing it forward into the light the way she wanted. But each failure taught her something the last one hadn't, and slowly, board by board, piece by piece, she built a reputation that traveled first through the county, then through the territory, and finally beyond it, carried by the same curiosity dealer from Denver who kept coming back for more, and then by others like him who heard through his contacts about a widow on a ranch who could coax figured walnut into furniture unlike anything east of the Mississippi. By the second summer she had outgrown the tack room entirely and converted the old barn into a proper workshop, with Nathaniel and eventually 2 more hired hands helping with the rougher labor, while Martha herself handled every piece of finished joinery personally, because she'd learned that customers paying premium prices wanted to know the hands that touched their furniture belonged to the woman whose name had become attached to the work. Kessler Twisted Walnut Furniture, the Denver dealer had taken to calling it in his advertisements, and the name stuck, spreading through catalogs and word of mouth until orders came from as far as Chicago, and once, astonishingly, from a buyer in Boston who'd seen a photograph of one of her cabinets in a trade magazine. Otis watched all of this unfold with the particular pride of a man who had doubted and been proven wrong, and found he didn't mind admitting it. He came by more often that second year, not out of worry now, but out of something that had grown quietly alongside her success, a fondness neither of them named directly, but both understood. And by the third summer, he had become as much a fixture at the ranch as Duke, though he was careful never to overstep, never to suggest that her success was anything but entirely her own doing. "You could sell this place and live comfortable in town now," he said to her once, standing in the doorway of the workshop, watching her sand the top of a cabinet destined for a hotel lobby in Denver, a hotel that had commissioned an entire suite of furniture for its main sitting room. "I could," Martha agreed. "I won't, though. This ranch is where I found it. Doesn't seem right to leave it now." Duke, who had grown grayer around the muzzle over those 3 years, but hadn't lost his habit of sleeping near whatever pile of wood Martha was working, lifted his head at the sound of her voice and thumped his tail twice against the workshop floor before settling back down. It was in the autumn of the 3rd year that Boone Whitfield rode out to the ranch with a request that surprised her. He was older now, too, married, running the timber operation himself since Garrity had finally retired and sold him the business outright, and he stood at the edge of Martha's workshop with his hat in his hands, looking considerably more humble than the young man who had once told her twisted walnut was only good for kindling. "I've got a proposition," he said. "The timber company's been sitting on stacks of twisted grain for years, more of it than you could use if you tripled your operation. I was thinking, instead of you just buying logs from us, maybe we ought to talk about a partnership. You handle the fine work, we handle the harvesting and rough milling. Split the proceeds fair." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him for a long moment before answering. 3 years ago you told me a knife wouldn't hold a line in this wood. Told me I'd be better off burning it." Boone had the grace to look embarrassed. "I know it. I was wrong. Been wrong about a fair number of things, seems like. And that was one of the worst of them. I've watched you build something out of what my own company was throwing on a burn pile for a decade. And I'd be a fool not to want a piece of that, now that I've seen what you can do with it." "Didn't ask if I could do it," Martha said, echoing the words Otis had spoken to her 2 winters before. Words that had stayed with her through every hard month since. "Now you're asking what happened to it." "I suppose I am." She thought about it for 3 days before answering, walking the fence lines with Duke at her heel, turning the offer over in her mind the way she turned every piece of wood before she cut into it, looking for the grain before she committed to a direction. In the end, she agreed, on terms that were fair to both of them, and the partnership that grew out of that conversation eventually became the largest supplier of figured walnut furniture west of the Mississippi, employing 24 hands within 5 years and shipping finished pieces to cities Martha had never seen and likely never would, though she kept her own workshop small and personal, still finishing the finest commissions with her own 2 hands, even as the business around her grew into something far larger than she'd ever imagined standing at the edge of that reject pile. A magazine out of Chicago sent a writer west the following spring to do a feature on what they called the frontier furniture phenomenon, and the writer spent 2 days at the ranch watching Martha work, watching Duke, now old and slow but still present at her side every waking hour, watching the way she ran her palm across a fresh-cut board before deciding how to proceed, the same gesture she'd made 3 years earlier standing in front of a pile of logs nobody else wanted. The article ran with a photograph of her standing in the workshop doorway, and it made her something of a minor celebrity in furniture circles back east, though she never much cared for the attention and preferred the quiet of her own land to any of the invitations that followed to speak at trade gatherings or exhibitions. She never remarried, though there were those in the county who assumed for years that she and Otis eventually would, given how often his horse could be found tied outside her barn on any given evening. What passed between them stayed mostly their own business, private and unhurried, the same way everything in Martha's life had become unhurried, since she'd learned that some of the best things couldn't be forced into being any faster than their nature allowed. 5 years after that first afternoon at the timber yard, Martha stood once more at the edge of a pile of rejected logs, though this time the pile belonged to her own company, a fresh haul from the North Ridge waiting to be sorted and graded before milling. Duke, old now, moving slower, still made his way over to sniff at the wood the way he always had, and Martha knelt down beside him and pressed her palm flat against the rough bark of the topmost log, feeling the familiar twist of the grain rising beneath her hand. A young hired hand nearby, new to the operation and not yet accustomed to the boss's habits, watched her with open curiosity.
"What are you looking for, ma'am?"
Martha didn't answer right away, the way she hadn't answered Boone all those years before. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the grain the way she'd learned to feel it, reading the story written into the wood by years of wind and weather that had twisted it into something the rest of the world had once called worthless. "I'm not looking," she said finally. "I'm listening. Wood like this has been fighting something its whole life. Wind, mostly, up on that ridge, or bad soil, or too much shade and not enough of it. It grew crooked because it had to, because straight wasn't an option for it. Everybody used to think that meant it was ruined." She opened her eyes and looked at the young man, and there was something in her expression that had settled into permanence over the years, a quiet certainty that no longer needed anyone else's approval to hold its shape. "Turns out crooked was just its way of surviving. And once you understand that, you stop asking whether it's good for anything and start asking what it's good for. That's a different question, and it changes everything. The young man nodded slowly, not entirely understanding, but recognizing that he'd been given something worth remembering, and went back to his sorting. Have you ever looked at something everyone else had given up on and wondered what they were missing? Sometimes the thing that makes a person or piece of wood difficult to work with is the very same thing that makes it worth the effort in the end. Martha Kessler built an empire out of logs a timber company couldn't give away fast enough, not by forcing the wood to be something it wasn't, but by learning to see what it already was and having the patience to bring that truth into the light. If her story moved you tonight, do me a kindness and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me what part of Martha's journey stuck with you most, and share this video with someone who might need a reminder that the crooked path is sometimes the one that leads somewhere worth going. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Tales of quiet people who found extraordinary things in the places nobody else thought to look. And I'd be glad to have you along for the next one. Until then, take care of yourselves, and remember that sometimes the twist in the grain is exactly what makes something beautiful.